Hey everybody, so we've been talking about the designers, and every production has a set designer, or what is sometimes called the scenic designer. I'll use those interchangeably. The set, or the scenery, is just the physical environment in which the actors perform. So on a stage, you have an empty stage. The set designer might just put a table on the stage, and that's the whole set. A set designer might also build an entire house with one wall taken out, so that we're looking through what's known as the fourth wall, and just looking into the house as if we're sort of little secret peeping toms in the audience. The set designer might stage something in the round with the audience sitting all around them, around the set, in which case the set is usually dropped down into the floor a little bit so that we don't obstruct sight lines. There's lots of different ways to design the physical environment in which the play takes place. So what I'm going to do is go through a little slideshow, talk about different kinds of theater spaces and stage spaces, performance spaces, different configurations that theaters can be set up in, and we're going to look at a few videos, and we're going to look at a bunch of images of scenic designs. So we'll specifically spend some time talking about stage spaces and theatrical environments, which is, I guess, a nice way to put it. So the first thing that's really important to wrap our heads around is the idea that there are different locations on a stage. Now, what we're looking at here is a bird's eye view, or a floor plan, essentially, of a stage broken into a grid. Down here, we have where the audience sits. This is known as the house, so sometimes we'll talk about the house of a theater. Out here is the apron. Now, not every theater has an apron that thrusts itself out into the audience to give the actors a bit more of an intimate experience with the audience, and vice versa. And here is the proscenium arch. So this would, if I were looking at it straight on, would go up, across, and down. We'll look at some images of that. But ultimately, directors and actors and designers all have to have a common language about what part of the stage they're talking about. So we use a little language where we talk about upstage and downstage, stage right and stage left. Now, historically, we called it upstage, so the part of the stage that's furthest from the audience, because way back in the day, audiences all sat on a level plane, and so they weren't raked up like this, like we're used to in most auditoriums. And so what they did, so that the audience could see all the actors, is they actually built a ramp, what we call a rake, where it was higher up here and it sloped down toward the audience. So if you were to put a marble on the floor, it would roll down into the audience. So that's why we call it upstage, because it was literally higher up. And then as you move down to downstage. So we have center stage here, up center, down center. Now, obviously you're going, wait a minute, that's my left. Nope. If you were on stage looking at the audience, that would be your right. So we call that stage right. So this is upstage right, or upright. Stage right, down right. Now, usually we tend to just break the stage into quadrants. So we just say up right, up left, down right, down left. Center stage is right in the middle. This is broken up into much more specific areas, which is important and useful. But typically you wouldn't hear anybody talking about up left center. That's getting a little bit more detailed than you'd hear people discuss. So those are stage areas. This image is of a proscenium stage. This here is the proscenium arch. So that's a big, long word, but you'll hear it a lot in this class and in theater from now on, and we'll visit the theater here at Catonsville, and that has a proscenium arch. There's also a proscenium arch in the big theater, the 440-something seat theater over at CCBC Essex. And this is a real classical design for a theater space. The very first one was the very first proscenium arch theater, was the Teatro Farnese in Italy. It was built, I think, sometime in the 13th century or 14th century. And that was the first time that audiences were exposed to this idea of sort of looking through this postcard at a whole world, right? So it's like a picture frame. So this is called a proscenium arch. We're looking through this picture frame, and we might have flats back here with scenery painted on them. We might have a big backdrop with a big painting on it. We could have a whole set in here, and we'll look at some images. But just take note of this as the proscenium stage. Now, this is a bird's eye view of a proscenium stage. This is the stage itself. Here is what we call the proscenium arches, right? We call those the proscenia on either side, and they arch up and above. And then again, you see this word apron, the part that comes toward the audience a little bit. Most stages, most proscenium stages anymore are built with orchestra pits. So it's a place underneath the stage where the orchestra can fit. And this would be where the musical director or conductor would stand. And the orchestra is underneath the stage, and they, depending on how big it is, it might go all the way back into here, and they would have monitors so that they could see what's going on stage. But and people in the audience would be able to see the orchestra or the conductor's head right here, conducting away, just poking up right at stage level. And that way the singers, if it's a musical or an opera, can see that conductor so that they can stay in time. These areas that the audience can't see are known as the wings. So we have a stage right wing, stage left wing. And that's so that the actors, the performers, can have a place to hang out right before they enter. Now, if they have time, they might hang out over in the green room or the dressing room. But when they're about to come on stage, they'll come and hang out in the wings. That's oftentimes where scenery gets brought in and out. Usually on one side, if not both sides of a theater, but usually just on one side, we have what's known as the fly rail. That's what rail means. And in most big proscenium theaters, including our theater here at CCBC Catonsville, as well as CCBC Essex, there's what's known as a fly system. So there's a whole bunch of space way up above the stage so that on this system of pulleys and ropes, we're able to fly scenery in. New backdrops, right? That can be a really effective way to establish location in a production. This stands for proscenium. FOH stands for front of house. So again, this is the house or where the audience hangs out. I've never heard anybody refer to it as an anteproscenium, but I like that phrase if you ever want to sound clever. So some proscenium stages or proscenium theaters have what's known as a thrust. So a big apron that's sort of thrust out into the audience to create a more intimate space for the performers, to get them closer to the audience. And this is a good example of a proscenium thrust. And our stage at CCBC Catonsville is a proscenium thrust. And it has, I believe, a 14-foot apron that comes all the way out from the proscenium line, which is right here, right? And it thrusts all the way down into the audience. Again, here's another good diagram of a really exaggerated thrust. So you can see this looks like it's probably 20 or 25 feet thrust all the way out into the audience. Again, here's our proscenium arch for our postcard. And in a theater like this, you could stage almost an entire production on the apron. So here's an example of a proscenium arch theater with a scenic design in it, with a set and an audience, a finished set. They have this sort of fun fake grand drape is what we would call that. A big curtain that hangs down in front. That's fake though. This is just something that they painted and cut out and used to sort of frame their set. And as we can see here, what's pretty neat about this set is that some of it is three-dimensional and built, like the stairs and the doors, and some of it is painted on the backdrop, and it blends pretty seamlessly to create that kind of eerie effect. So the next completely different style of space is the black box theater. A black box theater is typically a square-ish or rectangular space that could be a pretty wide range of sizes, but they tend to be about this big, like this image that we're looking at here. They tend to be very configurable, so you can move the seating around, which is different than a proscenium theater or an auditorium, where the seats are bolted to the floor. These tend to have groupings of seats on risers that can be manipulated and moved around in different areas. What we have here is a stage, obviously. So the stage is the floor of the black box. Most black boxes are painted black, so that they can go dark black or like a very dark blue. And then most black box theaters have some kind of catwalk or an area where technicians can be up above the stage to hang lighting, and we call that a lighting grid. And it's usually a whole bunch of piping that's sort of hashed up above the stage with all the lighting instruments hanging up there. And the catwalk just allows the technicians to move around and hang lights and focus lights, or to, you know, drop snow on the actors if there's a moment where they need snow, or leaves or rose petals if you want to have some fancy romantic scene. Catwalks are really fun. There's lots of cool things you can do with catwalks, like have performers rappel down ropes down onto the stage, etc. But the black box theater affords a real intimate experience, and the really quite special thing about a black box space is that the audience can see itself. So if I'm sitting here watching the action, I'm also able to see the audience here. Now, they're typically not going to be lit intentionally, but because the action is so close to the audience, or the audience is so close to the action, the lighting often spills over, and so we can see each other in the audience. It's interesting because it reminds us constantly that we're watching a play. We're not sort of being swept away or distracted from reality, because we're always sitting right there looking straight at other people. There are lots of different ways to configure a black box theater. I could, if I wanted, put my whole audience on one side and my stage on the other, right? So it'd be like a little mini proscenium. Sometimes we refer to that as an end-on configuration. Or I could put audience just on three sides, here, here, and here, so that I could build a bunch of scenery here and have my stage here. That's called a 3/4 thrust, right? So we have 3 of the 4 quarters of the space have audience on it. And this is configured in the round right now. And so we have the scenic design can only exist right here. And it can't be too intrusive because we don't want to block the audience's view. Now here's an example of a different configuration for a black box space. We have the audience just on 2 sides, which is a really pretty fun way to do it, because the audience really does wrap around it, but it allows you to go high with your set, so you can have big, tall levels. And I just think this is a bizarre set, made up of sheet music. These platforms look like the keys of a piano. This just looks like a piece of toast. So another configuration for a black box. This is a black box theater configured in a 3/4 thrust. Now you can't see the audience, but they're sitting here on the right, here on the left, and exactly where we're looking from is the front row of the center section. And this is a production of Lanford Wilson's Book of Days that I directed in 2014. And so in that 3/4 thrust, you see we're able to have a tall level back here. In fact, all of the actors stayed on stage the entire time for this production, sitting on stools, and they would gather their props from this spot here. These spaces served as various locations. This was a porch, it was an office, this here was an office, it was a kitchen, it was a lot of different things. Again, here's our 3/4 thrust, bird's eye view. This is a black box theater configured in an alleyway setup, what we call alleyway, because the stage itself is like an alley, right? We have audience just on either side, looking across at each other with all of the action happening in the middle. This one has entrances under the bleachers here. So these are called VOMs, V-O-M, where the actors can actually enter from beneath the audience. It's kind of like a stadium that way almost. And then you can have the action in the middle here with exits here and here. Oftentimes we'll see projections happening on the sides here. So this is like, it's a fun configuration because it gives you the best of in the round where the audience is really surrounding the action, but it also allows you to have levels, right? Because you could put levels over here and not have to worry about blocking the audience's view. Kind of describe, and what's really cool about this design is that we're in an intimate space, a black box theater, in a 3/4 thrust, which means there's audience sitting on 3 sides and then looking at a back wall, and they're able to see the actors up close and personal. And actually, if you look close enough, you can actually see there's a face of a person right there that's in the audience. So you can see how close they are. And in this configuration, what's really fun about this is that the audience is actually looking through the action. So you can see them here looking through the action across the stage, and they can actually see the audience on the other side. And so they're watching other audience members react, which is one of the really exciting and unique things about theater, is that we're there with a group of people, and in this case we can actually see them right through the other side of the action, depending on where we're sitting. Sometimes we see the backs of the actors, sometimes we see their profiles, as in this moment. Sometimes we see the back of one actor, the face of another over the shoulder, just like in this moment, which is really fun. In a way, it creates a cinematic quality there. Again, you can see the audience. It's almost like your own stationary camera, sort of watching a movie here. You can see the audience again, and I think that's just a really exciting element of a production that's staged in a small, intimate space. Which still may have 200 people in it, but to be sort of wrapped around the stage like that is a really exciting choice to make, and a rare choice to make with a play like Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is typically a really big production. So this is a neat choice. Now, scenically, as a scenic designer, if you're designing in a small space like this, on a small stage where the audience has to be able to see across the space, obviously you can't put big, giant scenic elements in the middle of the stage because they'll obstruct the view of most of the audience, depending on how steep the seating is. You always want to be thinking about, designers always want to be thinking about, okay, what's the best way that I can maximize the visuals so that the audience can see the actors' faces and their bodies. And the director always has to be thinking about, okay, well, I don't want to neglect these people over here in the corner. And so I have to make sure to stage it in such a way move the actors around in such a way to make sure that they're always seen as much as possible. And then the third kind of space that we're going to discuss in this video is the studio space, the studio theater. Now, this is one of the most common kinds of theaters out there because they require very little space. When I lived in New York City in my early 20s, these were the kinds of theaters I worked in. We had few resources, and oftentimes these theaters are the cheapest to build and to renovate and to rent out, because they're often like storefront retail spaces that are long, skinny rectangles, and you can convert them fairly painlessly into a studio theater in which you have the audience where we're sitting in this photo in one half on raked seating or risers or bleachers, looking out at the other half, which is where the stage is. And depending on how much audience you have certain depths of stage. And this would be sort of like a really miniature proscenium kind of configuration. What we often refer to, as I said earlier, an end-on, END-ON, an end-on configuration. Usually with doors going back to what was probably like a break room or something for employees, or a storage closet converted into dressing rooms, or various other kinds of areas. Sometimes you can create nice alleyway setups in studio theaters where I would have an audience on this side and audience on this side in a big performance space in the middle. Again, with a lighting grid up above for, here's a projector, lighting instruments, as you can see. Most studio theaters do not have high enough ceilings to have any kind of fly system, and certainly any kind of catwalk. So most of the time, technicians and lighting designers or projection designers have to focus all of their instrumentation from ladders, which is always dangerous. Here's another image of a studio theater. That's a cool image. Okay, so moving on in the scenic designer's process, one of the first things a scenic designer hopefully is going to do is do some little sketches, thumbnail sketches, right? Some of the best scenic design work I've ever seen done has been just sitting at a bar, drinking beer, drawing pictures on napkins. And if your scenic designer is a talented artist and can draw, which hopefully they can, they might be able to bust something like this out within, maybe 30 minutes. And you have a meeting, you sit and you chat and draw pictures together, and you get something like this. Just some kind of basic representation of what the scenic designer and director are thinking. We know this script. If we're using a script, we know it's got certain locations. We need to have a living room. So in this play, for example, we know that the entire thing takes place in a living room. And so all we have to do is draw a living room. And so that gives us what we need. Apparently it has an upstairs as well, though. So we know that they have to go upstairs. It looks like there's some upper level that might represent a bedroom or something. I also see what looks like a ladder drawn on the side here. So maybe there's another access point here. And then we also have a fence. So it looks like there's some exterior areas that have to be represented. And of course, some telephone poles with some shoes hanging on. Some wires. So maybe downstage is representative of a sidewalk or a street or something. But a good scenic designer will at least work with a director and give them some basic hand-drawn sketches so that they can really play around with ideas. Here's some other sketches. So the one on the left, obviously, is a good sketch. It's for Richard III. You can see that the audience is here on the sides, which would put us in what kind of configuration? Oh yes, a 3/4 thrust. So the way we're looking at it now would be from the center section, and then we can see the audience on the sides. And that's really helpful when a scenic designer draws the audience in, or parts of them, to give us a sense of scale. The one on the right here, I love this drawing. I don't really know what we're looking at exactly. I mean, it's clearly some kind of basement area, and maybe this is the edge of the stage here. It's sort of hard to tell. This is a bit more of a creative representation of what a scenic designer is going for, trying to capture maybe more of a feeling than of something really very realistic, but it's a really neat rendering. Here's another example of a designer's rendering for a scenic design. It's just a playground for a director to move actors around on. And then after playing with drawings, once a director and a scenic designer have settled on some of their favorite ideas, once they've kind of got it down, a designer might go, okay, I'm ready to make a model, a 3D model, what's sometimes called a white model. They may not paint it, so it might just be with white foam. Looks like they're using some really heavy-duty cardstock in this 3D model. But these models are always done to scale, usually 1/4 inch scale. So, you know, if I have a 6-foot person, be a 1/4 inch 6 times, right? Usually they always put a person, a model of a person on the stage, usually 6 feet, just to give the director a sense of scale. And it really helps because then the director's got something really malleable that they can work with and move figures around on. I love having models or white models because I can take them home while I'm planning my staging process, and I can go, okay, cool, well, the scenic designer gave me this, this, and this, and now I can take my little figurines and move them around. I've been doing that since I was about 3.5. There's another example of a model. You can also just go out and buy scaled figurines. And here you can even see the audience. They made a little audience here. Love that. This scenic design is great. I love how the stage actually comes out on these little walkways into the audience. Here's another model, again, of a black box theater with a play in it that apparently takes place in an airport. This is terminal baggage claim. Again, we can see a representation of the audience to get a sense of scale, body so that we get a sense of scale. There's another one in a proscenium setup. So in this case, the scenic designer even included the proscenium arch so that I have a real good sense of that postcard view that I'm looking through. So in this one, this is fairly realistic. We have a fairly representational set. It's supposed to look like a courtroom. And what we're getting as the audience is a fourth wall perspective. So we have to imagine that this is the fourth wall here, and it's just taken out for our viewing pleasure. We're just looking into this world. Cool, so here's a model on the left for a set design and the realized set design on the right. I think that's a fun way to look at these. So we get a model here of this arrangement. I believe this is Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, or some Oscar Wilde play. I love the dome, which would create some neat shadow with lighting coming through. And I believe this is in a proscenium theater. It's got a very rounded, thrust out stage that comes out onto the apron. Now, some scenic designers, more and more these days, are using computerized CAD systems, computer-aided drawing systems. like Vectorworks and other types of other softwares that give us three-dimensional computer-aided models, visual models that can be printed and that can be easily changed without having to get out X-Acto knives and glue. Some other examples of Vectorworks models. Cool. So we're moving on now into images of different scenic designs. So I'm not going to say a lot about each of these. If I know what it is, I'll mention it. But you'll see simple stuff and some other really spectacular images. This is a scenic design for production of Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex. It's an opera. I have a few images from this venue, which is a pretty famous theater on the shore of a lake in Sweden. And this is a big opera festival. And they actually build these incredible sets right there in the water. There's another one. So this gives you a sense of spectacle and the kind of scale that theatrical performance can take place in. Obviously, you don't need to be in a theater in order to have theater. That's usually how I distinguish between the word theater, spelled T-H-E-A-T-E-R, a theater space, versus theater as in the art form, T-H-E-A-T-R-E, which is just the activity, the art form, the discipline. So this one here doesn't require a theater, it just requires a lake shore and a bunch of seats. This is back inside a theater space. I like how the costume design and the scenic design complement each other and work with each other so much in this image. Something like ropes hanging from the fly system or from the catwalk are also a really integral part of a scenic design. It doesn't necessarily have to be just what is solid, what people walk on and sit on. It could be something as delicate as tinsel hanging in the background. This is a scenic design for a production of Treasure Island that was done at the National Theatre in London a couple of years ago. And this was one of the most spectacular scenic designs I've ever seen in my life. I got to see the production, and it transforms on a number of different times the locations. Of course, Treasure Island takes place on a ship, in an inn and a tavern in England, as well as the Treasure Island, the island. And this scenic design transformed from all three of those major locations. At one point, this is an inn by a little road, and then during one of the transitions, this whole ship comes up out of the floor. This 2-story ship comes out of the floor. These big roped riggings fly down from the fly system. All these actors are already in it, and so all these pirates just appear. And it's just a really pretty incredible spectacle. The whole thing as well is on a very, very large revolving stage. So this is what's called a revolve in theater. It's a great way to create scenic changes. It's typically quite expensive because it's a whole mechanized system. But it's a great way to create transitions. It's a great way to stage travel. Characters traveling because they can actually walk with like a treadmill. And in this case, this theater, the Olivier Theater at the National Theatre in London, it works on kind of like a corkscrew, and it can rotate up and bring up a whole new set almost instantaneously. It's really pretty incredible. I'll show you a video of a set on a revolve right now. So here's another example of scenic design staged on a revolving stage, or what we just call a revolve. So right now we're beginning to see the set, the entire set for this production of Henrik Ibsen's The Doll's House from 2012 in London. This whole set, this house, is revolving in front of us. So imagine that you're sitting in the front row of the theater right now. You're not moving. The camera's not moving. This is all in live time. And the set is just revolving right in front of you. So there are all these rooms. It's basically an entire house without exterior walls or a roof, so that it can be lit and so that we can see it. But it's got all the interior walls. We see the actors moving in and out and around. We're getting introduced to the main players. And what's so fun about this is what the scenic designer did is he gives the director the opportunity to stage this play almost like it's in an actual house, in an actual environment there that just passed. Over here is one of the main characters, and here's another one of the main characters. And so the timing of the staging for the director moving the actors around would be really, really exciting in a scenic design like this. And then you'll see right in and about here, this is where the actual play begins. It settles, and we have the first scene. Here's some more images. This is a nice use of levels. This is an image actually of a production of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children in New York in the 70s. In a space called the Performance Garage. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It was a garage in Soho in New York, so downtown New York. And you can actually see a garage door here. This is an old industrial part of Manhattan. So most of the buildings, any theaters that are there are converted warehouse spaces or retail spaces or storage spaces or whatever. And this company, the performance group, they didn't like accommodate audiences at all. They just built their set in however they wanted it to look. So they created whole performance environments, not just a set or a stage, but they're just like, let's build the whole world that we want. And then when the audience comes in, just tell them to sit wherever they can find a seat. And then the actors would just kind of adjust. Some productions, I think they were told where to sit, and another production it was just kind of a free-for-all. But hey, it was the 70s. But yeah, you can see like clearly there wasn't much concern about, audience members falling to their death. I mean, these people are sitting way up high. But I love that. And what's really fun about that is you can these kinds of sets is you can stage actors amongst the audience and then have actors arise in the middle of the performance and join the performance. Something I really enjoyed about this image, I have no idea what the production is, but it's clearly inspired by the work of one of my favorite visual artists, N.C. Escher.
Probably one of the first images that I started with was this painting by Dean Mitchell called Midwest Mansion, and it's a painting of a mansion outside of Columbus, Ohio. The picture looks like this narrow sort of farmhouse, and you get the idea that it might be in the suburbs from these shadows off in the distance of other houses. And I really like that idea of like a farmhouse being surrounded by the suburbs. To me, the house really kind of takes on the personality of Joe. It stands in direct opposition to the ground. It's out there like some great big monolithic structure. You get this real sense of an iconic American home. That painting, Midwest Mansions, actually reminded me of other American artists like Edward Hopper and Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth's color palette really spoke to me, and Edward Hopper's sort of sense of the off-kilter and strong straight lines. There's a painting of his house by the railroad, and in the back you see this kind of almost kind of French chateau building, and in the front there's the raised line of the railroad that passes by the house, and it's very strong. The house is a little bit off-kilter, and then the railroad in front comes in at a very low angle that kind of sets the whole thing off. The way that he sees the Midwest and American architecture and kind of paints them in a really modern perspective, and seems to be talking about what modernism is doing to the American past and how they're going through that transitional period. So then I took those images and started sketching, and I knew that I wanted it to land somewhere between abstract and real, kind of an amalgamation of the two. And I went through a lot of different sketches, some very abstract. We were seeing the show in a factory, and others very literal. I went through probably like 3 or 4, maybe even 5 different white models. But after some contemplation, Jerry asked me to try to escape a little bit further from all the realism. The fences were always present in all of my drawings from the very beginning. There was always the sense of the outside world of the yard and the inside world of the yard. The downstage portion kind of cuts across stage at this interesting diagonal that makes the whole set, to me, feel a little bit off-kilter or exciting, or some sort of element of conflict about the entire thing. The fence, to me, and in Joe's world, holds his family in and keeps the outside world at bay. And then downstage front, I just wanted to slice the fence completely open so that we can actually see the actors. And because I think that somehow our gaze is brutal in that way, and kind of, I like that, that we're actually, this is somehow, I don't know why, but somehow a cruel act, or it feels like we're doing something wrong by looking at this. An important element to the storytelling, or something that I think really serves the storytelling, are the 3 windows that are downstage. Through the kitchen window, I'm looking forward to seeing Kate move a lot. She kind of occupies this weird middle ground. I would say that the set is largely realistic, but that at the edges it kind of becomes more abstract. The fence kind of starts to move in interesting abstract ways, and the walls of the house disintegrate at the top and to the sides. Jerry talked about seeing the play as kind of a boxing match, and I identify with that, with all these people popping in and out of the ring. So I wanted to incorporate this idea of the ethereal. It feels like this play is kind of elevated to that realm in some way. It's more than just a play about a family, it's a play about all of our families. What happens in this yard affects the rest of the world.
So now that you've seen a whole bunch of different kinds of theater spaces, you've seen a bunch of imagery, you've seen some videos of different configurations, thinking about the plays that we've read so far this semester, I want you to choose one of those plays that we've read so far and decide what kind of space, so what kind of theater Theater, your production will take place in: a proscenium theater, a black box theater, or a studio theater, and what kind of configuration it's going to be in. Is it a proscenium thrust with a big apron? Is it a black box theater in 3/4 thrust, alleyway, or in the round? Or is it a studio theater with an end-on configuration, or maybe a small studio theater in an alleyway configuration? And I want you to sketch a scenic design for a production of the play. Just do your best. This isn't about being the world's greatest artist, but it could be a head-on image, or it could be a bird's eye floor plan sort of image. Take some ideas from some of the sketches and renderings that you see in the video, and bring that to the next class.